Hi, we're students of Christ School in Richmond, and our project is called Between the Locks. It tells the story of people who have lived and worked on the upper tidal Thames between Richmond and Teddington locks. What follows is their story about how the river has affected their lives.
Well, I worked for a company called S.E. Peasley, and that was at Richmond Bridge. And as I say, I started with the father really, just by saying, do you want a hand, mister? And, well, you can get that boat up for me, or you can do that. In the end, I started going down there first thing in the morning. I used to get him a dozen boats ready for the day. Always come home for lunch, go down and see him. If he wanted anything done at the time, do it then, and then back to school. And then when I came home in the evening, or the afternoon, didn't have homework in those days. I was down on the river again, helping out, putting the boats away at the end of the day. And I was doing that every day of the week.
Watermen handled passengers, but lightermen handled goods, basically, from ships, docks, wharves, warehouses. And very often watermen, they were lightermen as well, but they did lighterage in the winter, in the cold months. And in the summer they turned to passenger pleasure boats, that sort of thing.
When you're first apprentice, you go to the Waterman's Hall in London, St Mary at Hill, and you're bound over by the court. What they call a court is it's like being in a court. The judge, the master of the hall, sits in the big chair with a wig on and the gown, and they apprentice you to the river. And when you're apprentice, they give you your indentures. Then after 2 years, you have to go back to the Waterman's Hall. Then they ask you questions about the river, all different questions. And if you get them all right, they give you your 2 years licence. Well, after 7 years, you go up again for your full licence. So your waterman's licence, lighterman's licence, then they ask you all sorts of questions. If you pass, they give you the freedom of the Waterman's Company and the River Thames.
Now every bridge on the Thames, where every tide set, and that is when you've got to reach. And where does the tide set on that reach? Could be here, could be there, but where it sets, you've got to know that. You have to know how the bridge was built. Was it stone? Was it timber? Was it iron? Lots of things.
Oh well, like all apprentices, you start from the very bottom and do the job. It did in those days involve doing naval architecture, which I took an interest in, and did involve me in the early days designing 1 or 2 boats. But later, when you get further on in the company, you don't really have time to design boats. Nice to do, but you actually sketch them out and employ somebody else to develop them and build them, you see. So in actual fact, from going to school to going in the firm was automatic, as in fact it was in my son. Well, you'd always get the worst jobs. You sometimes were underneath the boat and you had to drive a bolt up, and then when you drove it up and got it out, all the water came out on you, so you got soaking wet. That's the sort of job you got. But eventually you learned how to do, according to, there's a great difference really in a way, there used to be, in trades there aren't now, but there used to be. A joiner would make furniture, a boat builder would make boats, but not furniture. He wouldn't make the furniture normally. And everybody would have their own trade, a plumber. And of course, we did have a bit of trouble with demarcation, but there was a certain amount of demarcation, inevitably, because a plumber wouldn't know how to install an engine, and an engineer wouldn't know how to do plumbing, because in fact they were all complicated Not like today when you buy the thing and you've got a set of instructions and that you have to work it out yourself.
It was a good job, but it was very hard. In my days, we used to start at 6 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes you get home 10 o'clock at night, and sometimes you didn't get home at all. You go to work on a Monday morning and you come home Friday. You used to tow barge. I used to be, when I was apprentice, I was in the tug, a boy in the tug. Then when I got my licences, which is these two here, and then you was allowed to be in charge of the lighters. They was towed down the river from Brentford, towed down to all the wharves in London, in the docks. Then you used to take them to the ship, and then you used to get cargoes out the ship, load them in the lighters. Then you used to undock them again out the docks, and there was a tug waiting for you to tow you to your destination. But if it wasn't a tug, you used to drive them about, what they call drive them, row the barges in those days, and it was very hard, and especially in the winter when the snow and ice, and the ropes was stiff. You used to hold the ropes up like that, and sometimes you used to have to cut them, chop them, because you couldn't undo them, because they was all frozen, icicles hanging from them, and you just had your bare hands.
Lighterman basically worked for the National Dock Labour Board. If anyone ashore, waterman, lighterman, working on the River Thames, the National Dock Labour Board, they paid dockers, stevedores, watermen, lightermen, and if I was working for a company and then they didn't have any work for a few days, they would put me what we used to call on the pool, and we used to go to report to a pool office, and it was a place where all lighterage firms would phone up and say, I need a lighterman for tomorrow, that sort of thing. But anyone not working on the river, they used to go to the National Labour Exchange, and they would go there, and companies would phone up and say, I need someone to work in my factory, or I need someone to deliver papers, or I need someone to do this and that. But the two things were entirely separate, land and river. We worked for the National Dock Labour Board. The National Dock Labour Board paid us, basically, flat rates of pay. But when it come to working on the pleasure boats, the pleasure boat companies did tend to offer a bit more. Yeah. What did I enjoy? The freedom, because literally I was on my own, had to make my own decisions, my own mistakes, correct them, travelling in the open air, healthy, although in them days there was a lot of smog around, but it was healthier than most. That's why I enjoyed it.
Well, do you remember that time when this barge crashed into the bridge and all the timber fell off it?
We were like scavengers.
Do you know, we walked out from the shore to the middle arch, picked up a piece of timber and walked back over the river and put it on the foreshore.
Over the timber?
Well,
It was already
we went
how
round
much it was?
We went round the police station and said, we want to report some timber. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, there's a whole barge load fallen off the river, off a barge. I said, we picked it out of the river, it's all stored down the river. If somebody comes along in the night time and starts to pinch it, we're telling you we've got it. So we rang up the RDMSR, I remember. So I said, the ham came through yesterday, and he said, we know all about it. I said, well, we've got the timber. He said, have you? I said, yes, on the foreshore outside the boathouses. So he said, do you want to buy it? I said, you can't afford to buy that sort of stuff. So he said, well, do you want to buy some of it? So I said, well, you don't want to buy something, you don't want to sell something. He said, well, it's going to cost us too much, he said, to come down, put it on a lorry and take it back. So he said, do you want to make me an offer? Well, you don't want to make an offer, do you? I said, well, you tell me how much you want. He said, well, you could have a lot for £50. And we sold it to him. We had a whole boathouse full of chicken.
Not only that, we built our rafts out of it as well.
Made new boxes on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've had some luck with. Yeah.
At the grand old age of 15, I was apprenticed to famous firm of boat builders at Putney called Sims. And I should add that the other half of my family, who were called Biffin, my mother's family, were oar and scull makers and boat builders from Hammersmith for a long, long time. So I had the right credentials, as it were, to enter the profession. And in those days it was quite hard. Cycled, I lived in Barnes, cycled to Putney. My governor, a lovely man called Jeff Thorne, who's long since dead, but he taught me the hard way. They had invented electric drills by this time, but he would not allow them anywhere near his boats. So we had to use either a hand drill like that or an Archimedes drill that worked like that. And he didn't like electric light even, he preferred gas lights. And we're only talking about in the 50s, but he was that sort of man. And when I'd been there about 20 minutes, he'd given me a huge plane, great big wooden jack plane about that long, about this square. I said, plane the edge of that bit of wood. So I planed it and managed to take the knuckle off my thumb with the plane. He said, don't bleed on my wood.
And walking into the dock, a 15-year-old boy, walking into the dock, and there was great big P&O liners, engraving docks, bits of wood holding them up, and propellers the size of houses. And you walk through that area, and there was all the skills and crafts that you could possibly see. Shipwrights, platers, marine electricians, dock workers, crane drivers, ship's clerks, coopers. All of these things was in front of you as you walked through that dock gate. And it was, I always describe it as when you open them books and all them things stand up in front of you. That's what it was like. It was an amazing, for a 15-year-old boy to walk through these dock gates and then get aboard the tug, and then you'd make the tea and you'd pick the craft up. There'd be little tugs fetching barges out to you, and you'd work your way down the Albert Dock where there were ships from side to side, two abreast, right the way down the dock, discharging their cargoes, coming from all around the world. It was an amazing, for a young lad to be down there and to be part of all that.
I can remember that I was in bed and my mum came up and got me up. She said, come on, put on your raincoat over your pyjamas, we're going down to the river. And of course in the wartime it was always double summertime, so in the summer it never really got very dark. And I said, what's it for? And she said, come down, you will see. And of course there were no lights anywhere in the war. Anyway, so we went down and looked, and there were some of my neighbours there, all very quiet because it was solemn. And then down this side of the island, and it doesn't happen now because they don't dredge it outside where the boats are done. They used to dredge it and make a deeper channel. Came a few boats, and my dad was on the Tigris, which was Tough Brothers' tug at the front, with just one tiny leading light. And behind came a lot of big boats. And I said, what is it? And she said, they're going over, the boats are going to Dunkirk. And my dad took his up to Sheerness and was moored up behind a destroyer all night. And he was very sick, he said, because it was a little tug. It was this all the time. But he wasn't sent over because he was working on the boats. And he came back with a big paper thing full of shrimps, which was lovely because in the war you didn't have much to eat. So we ate the shrimps, and all those boats went over to Dunkirk to rescue the men.
Dunkirk little ships. Well, I knew very little about it, though I lived at home. My father was very, very tight. He didn't tell us anything. or didn't tell me anything. What he's told my mother, I don't know, but he was very, very tight, and of course we were very, very scared. There's a Jerry under the bed. Do you heard that, have you? Of course we all thought there was, well, the Germans gave the impression that there was a third column in everywhere, you know, and they said for every 2 columns we got outside Britain, we got a third column in Britain who was keeping an eye on what you're doing. So not a lot got talked about, and so I didn't know much about it. But he was out a lot, and of course all these boats kept arriving at the yard. And he in fact went up and commandeered them, just took them away from where they were, and very often without even notifying the owner, because he had instructions to collect them and take them away, and that was that. They were taken to our Ferry Road yard. We were working on building in the Manor Road yard, and the Ferry Road yard was not really in use in the war, so we took them there, filled them up, took all the surplus stuff off, had a great big pile of surplus stuff there, and then of course my father had the job of trying to find crews for these boats, because the Navy couldn't crew them, so he had to try and think of people who were capable of taking the boats across the channel, because it's no fun taking a motor cruiser across the channel, and especially if it's bad weather, which fortunately it wasn't. And they took the boats across the channel. He managed to find somebody who was a bit of an engineer, and somebody who was a skipper, could navigate the thing, and they took them down, and they were only told they were going to take them to Gravesend. They said you were taking them down to Gravesend, and they're going to be kept there in case it's extensive bombing, and they'd use them for evacuating London, you see. That's what they were told when they left Teddington. When they got down to Gravesend, the officer there said, "Oh, you can't stay here, go down to Southend." So off they went down to Southend Pier. Well, some of them hardly knew where Southend Pier was. Anyway, they somehow got there, and when they got to Southend, the officer there said, "You can't stay here, you've got to go over to Sheerness," you see, which of course was a fairly big naval base in those days. And so they went over to Sheerness, and then they found out what it was all about. The naval officer there said, "We're wanting you to take the boat, or we're seeking crews to take boats over to Dunkirk." And in actual fact here, in the book here, I've got a piece of paper people were given as to how they were to get there. But of course it was like a stream of boats. I don't think it was Follow Me Leader almost. And of course they all went over, and very few of them turned it down.
And when our house was bombed, it was when the flying bombs, doodlebugs, had really just started, June 1944. And what happened is the engine would go, and there was silence. And it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, and whoa! Anyway, my father said I wasn't to go to school, and he'd got to go to work. So he went off on his bike. I went up and lay on my bed. I remember him saying, "Bye, Freed, bye, Freed." And I hope I answered him, because it's the last time I ever spoke to him. And off he went, and my mother went and lay on the couch